Kia ora and welcome to chapter 4 in the book The Future of Learning. And in the previous chapter we looked at how the brain actually senses our world, and in this chapter we're looking at sequencing. Sequencing historically was about learning to be able to speak and listen. And speaking and listening gave us huge capacity in terms of communicating effectively and efficiently in a very, very short space of time, and also communicating very precisely. So as our vocabulary increased, we could be more and more precise about what it is we were trying to communicate to each other. This worked really well for us, and it really gave us the ability to organise ourselves much better, to structure societies, etc. So over the last thousands of years, we've really developed speaking and listening to a really high level. What we've also done, though, is we've adapted speaking and listening to do something quite different again. And that's quite recently we've taken that up. And what it's adapted to is actually adapting to read and write. Now, reading and writing has no pattern to it. You can't look at the word rat and go, oh, I think that'll be furry and a little bit scary and have 4 legs and whiskers and it may shuffle around in a small mammal. You can't do that. You can't look at the letter O and know straight away what the sound will be. You've got to remember that. You've got to remember the sequencing of words. Okay? So, reading and writing requires a totally different learning approach. And historically, we haven't done much rote learning off by heart. We simply didn't have to remember lots of stuff in the past. Mostly we had ideas and concepts about things. Our trades used to teach us how to actually do things in a particular sequence, and we had ideas here, 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 in a sequence of ideas, but learning off by heart wasn't actually part of our historical learning process. It was only when reading and writing came along did we actually have to think about remembering large amounts of information off by heart. As a consequence, we're incredibly poor at this. Now, some communities have been reading and writing longer than others, some societies, some countries, and that's given them an advantage. So some people, we've learnt to do rote learning better than others. And if you're a teacher listening to this, you're probably in the top 20%, in the 20-80 ratio we talked about earlier. And so you are the success stories of schooling, because essentially you chose your parents well. And it was all about how well you chose your parents as to how well you could learn to read and write. There's a direct correlation. If you have a child who's struggling with their reading and writing and you get the parents in, it takes you about half a nanosecond to realise what the problem is. But we haven't actually realised the implications of that. The implications of that is that we end up with quite a significant distribution curve of success when it comes to reading and writing. That suited us last century because that distribution curve pretty much convinced 80% of people they weren't that smart. So we had 20% going off to university, 80% went and did boring, monotonous, tedious jobs in factories, mostly. Right? And that kind of worked for us. In this century, as we spoke about earlier, we've now got 80% of people in this side of the equation. We need 80% of people who are smart, articulate, can speak well, can actually collaborate with each other, can actually communicate effectively across a range of different media. That is now what is actually employers and our communities want. Our friends want us to be able to communicate accurately. We want to have good discussions with each other. So the 2080 of last century with reading and writing, now we've got to do something about that. Somehow we've got to level the playing field so we get 80% of people across the line, at least, not 20%. And that's going to put reading and writing in a very difficult position. And when I speak to people about giving kids the option of watching a video, because watching a video is what we're doing now when talking about the flipped classroom, is much more effective for everyone. In other words, it's a fairer way of learning because it's not dependent on your parents and how much video they watched. We process video much more equitably than we learn to read and write. And this has given us a huge conundrum. I love books. My house here, we've got books everywhere, and my children grew up with the books, and they love books, and we love reading, but genetically, they were gifted the capacity to read and write and were successful. But is that fair for everyone? And the answer is, no, it's not. So how do we address this? When do we say to some children, you know what, reading and writing is not working out too well for you, maybe we just let you watch the video. And when you've actually watched that video, you can create a video, like we're doing now in this session here, create a video to represent your understanding. So you can speak that out rather than having to write that out. That would be a more equitable system. So today we talked about our senses. That's equitable for everybody. Speaking and listening, there's variation, but it's reasonably equitable. When it comes to reading and writing, there's a huge distribution curve. And we have to address this. It's the elephant in the room that we kind of know exists. But now, with the changing requirements of our communities and societies, we have to address it much more precisely and ask what are some of the solutions we can bring to the fore which allows equity for learning right across the board for everyone. So people who go off and watch a movie, 80% don't come out and think, I didn't get any of that movie whatsoever. Of course they got the movie. Right? We can process those images, we can pick up the ideas and concepts being discussed and paraded through that. We don't have to remember it off by heart, but we remember the big ideas and the concepts that stuck underneath that movie that we just watched. And so it's a much more efficient way of learning. And we're now choosing that as educators. We're going to YouTube to do our searches increasingly, not Google. So Google is starting to give way to YouTube, which is why Google bought YouTube. They could see the future, and they realized, in fact, that we wouldn't be searching in Google for much longer. We'd drift quite considerably across to video because it's more efficient and more effective for more people. In other words, if your reading and writing is not very good, you can still search Google. You might have to type a few words in, but increasingly now, YouTube will accept voice input. So you can just speak to your machines. We do that already with our phones. We talk to Siri and ask her all sorts of questions. So increasingly, we're seeing a shift from reading and writing, through to oral language. Oral language and multimedia combined, which is why we've put the videos in the book, because I'm pretty much guaranteeing most people are going to watch the video and then go to the book to just back up some of the things that we haven't unpacked completely in these short videos. But videos are very, very powerful medium because it is so much more sensory data being made available to you to learn from. So when it comes to our sequencing, the sense of our capacity to learn by sequencing for speaking and listening is reasonably fair and equitable, but when it comes to our adaptation of that to writing and reading, that's not so fair, because we've only really been doing it for a short period of time, so there's huge variation in terms of capacity there. And as it is, even people who speak and listen well and can read and write well, that reading and writing component still takes us 5,000 hours to learn. It's a huge amount of time and effort, and very frustrating for everybody. And what's worst about the whole process here is that, generally speaking, reading and writing is our first learning experience in school. And so kids stereotype themselves and say, well, I'm not a good learner of anything because I can't do reading and writing. And so they don't attempt to apply their learning capacity to any other domain. And so we have to deal to this, and it's a really difficult one. Politically it's difficult, ethically it's difficult, there's a whole bunch of difficulties around this. And we need to start having those conversations now. How do we address that? Okay, so that's chapter 4, looking at sequencing. And chapter 5, we're going to discuss next. We're going to start looking at patterns and how the brain just loves patterns, and patterns underpin this whole notion of ideas and concepts. So thank you very much, and you can pop and read the chapter now if you wish. Thank you.